organizations. Having had success with other departmental histories, notably English, and there are probably many others that I wasn't around for, the program committee of the Historical Society came up with the idea of approaching Al to do the history of psychology at Stanford. As his next-door neighbor, I was given the honor of both inviting and introducing him. And what an honor it is. This year marks Al's 50th anniversary at Stanford. He was recruited by Ernie Arbuckle from Dartmouth in 1961 to come to Stanford as a GSB professor. Having already served as department chair of psychology at Dartmouth, he was quite relieved to be ridding himself of administration, as he's told me in stories, and actually gloated to his colleagues at Dartmouth that he was getting out of this administration thing. And came to Stanford, and within a year, the then dean of H&S approached Al to serve as chair of psychology. So his administration duties returned. What transpired and preceded that appointment will be the subject of Al's talk today, as he shares stories and remembrances of this department's meteoric rise in the country. What isn't in the talk today is how much Al's slightly reluctant return to administration enriched Stanford in the decades that followed. He became, from chair of psychology, he became dean of H&S, and then later, and that was under Dick Lyman, and then later provost under Don Kennedy. He became emeritus in 1990, but that hasn't slowed his wonderful contributions to this great university. And that's true of Barbara too, and who's my dear neighbor. And her many official and unofficial roles have enriched the community at Stanford in so many ways. Bill and I couldn't have more wonderful neighbors. So with that, please join me in welcoming Al Hastorf on the history of psychology at Stanford.
Thank you, my dear. Good afternoon. Boy, it's loud. Does it seem mostly loud to you, Gordon?
You're just right.
It sounds awfully loud to me. I'm going to take my coat off. You're a happier looking audience than I just was with in Memorial Church. Larry Crowley was a good friend. Okay. I want to begin by thanking two people, one of whom can't be here because his name is Jack Hilgard, and he's been dead for quite a while. The other is Karen Bartholomew, who is not a bit dead, who's just been a tremendous help in organizing this. I mentioned Jack because he did the first history of the psychology department, of which he was a significant part. Let me begin by saying a word or two personal, because I think one of the interesting things about this is that this burgeoning of psychology was not just here in Stanford, it was all over the country. And when I became a freshman at Amherst College in 1938, there was one professor of psychology, and his title was actually Professor of Psychology and Professor of Philosophy, and he was really a philosopher. His name was Charles Toll, and he was important to us because his son had just been made captain of the Princeton football team. And he was a dull fellow. I did not take a course from him because in my sophomore year, the college chose to appoint a real psychologist and appointed a guy, Gordon must know the name, Glenn Heathers, who was a PhD of who? Probably Clark Hull's at Yale. And the Yale people were the dominant people in American psychology then. I think. Anyway, Glenn Heathers was a very organized fellow who I suppose taught a good course. I took it. I didn't think it was that good. And like most of my age mates at Amherst, I majored in history. Amherst is a place, as I mentioned earlier today, that is famed for producing teachers, preachers, and bond salesmen. The outcome of my time at Amherst in psychology was that I received a fellowship to go study history at Harvard and went. And I was only there for about 6 months when, with World War II upon us, I went in service. And I went in service, and through some complex system that the military had, I found myself not having had basic training or anything, but shipped out to Denver, Colorado to teach the caliber 50 machine gun. Now, I had never seen a machine gun. So what they did was put us through the course that we were going to teach. And so after, it was 3 weeks on the caliber 50 and this caliber 30. Well, I did that for about 3 months, and it was getting awfully damn dull. And I was suddenly blessed with a wonderful class. First of all, they were all very short, and they were all draftees out of the University of Chicago, and they were all, I guess, just barely 18, old enough to be drafted. And so the Air Force was going to make them aerial gunners, obviously, and they had to learn a machine gun to do that. But these were extremely bright young men. Hutchins had, gone around and recruited them from around the country. And they were so bright that we got through my material in about half time. So I had a week, which I didn't know what the hell to do. So I said, well, let's have a debate on Robert Hutchins and the great books versus, and I picked John Dewey as his opponent and learned by doing. And I organized them into 2 teams. It was hard recruiting someone to defend John Dewey, but I talked them into it. And we were in the midst of the debate. It was going great when a brand new second lieutenant came on an inspection tour and chewed me out in front of the class, loudly, vitriolically. And I finally said, may I interrupt, sir? And he said, yeah. I said, you ask these guys any question you want about the guns and they'll answer them for you. Yeah, he didn't take that, and he stormed out. So I got myself down to the base classification officer and said, I think it's time for me to do something different. He said, oh, I'm so glad you came in. There's a new program called the Army Specialized Training Program, and I'm going to send you up to the University of Wyoming, which was near Denver, for you're going to be classified. So I went up to the University of Wyoming. I'd never seen it. It was nice to be on a college campus again. And I took 3 days worth of tests. I didn't realize there were as many artificial language tests as we had. So we did them. And at the end, I'm taken into another brand new second lieutenant who was going to classify me. And it had been a long day. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon, and I came in. I said, Hastorf, corporal. I was a corporal. And he said, oh, God, Hastorf, thank God. It's been a bad day, but you're easy. I said, that made me nervous. And I said, what? He said, well, we're going to send you to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor for 3 years to study German language and culture. Well, now, I'd taken a couple of years of German at Amherst and learned that I didn't like that language. And the idea of doing it for, full time. And I looked desperate. I stood up, I said, isn't there anything else I can do? He said, no, boy. Look at, you studied European history. You took some German. You got a German name. You said, you're perfect. And I literally stood up and looked over his shoulder and said, there must be something else that I'm qualified for. And I said, oh, look at that. There's psychology. I'll do that. And he said, well, you have to have had 3 courses in psychology. And whereupon it was not very hard to be creative, because courses at Amherst then lasted a full year. So there was Psychology 1 for a full year. So he said, okay, that's all right, that's 2. So I said, then we took statistics and economics. And he said, okay. So they sent me to the University of Minnesota, where I thought they did a first-class job. We had all the regular faculty, and they taught us just psychology. I didn't realize you could study the same subject all day, but we did. And we finished there, and they had a little graduation ceremony when a fellow some of you will know, Hank Rieken, and I graduated as first in the class, whatever that meant. And our honor was to be sent to Lincoln, Nebraska, to an air base to do guard duty. Well, things went along and then they changed finally, and I ended up in a research unit captained by Stuart Cook, who was a first-class guy who ended up as chairman at NYU and then chairman at the University of Colorado. So I became a psychologist. I'll say just one other autobiographical thing, and that is, how did I come to go to Dartmouth? And the answer to that is, when I got through, I picked Princeton mainly because Princeton quite explicitly says they have no requirements. You have to pass the language exams, you got to pass a 5-day general examination, then you got to write a thesis. And that's all you need. There's no 3-year or 2-year requirement. So I went there, and after 2 years I went into the chairman and said, I'm now ready to find a job. And he said, but you only got here a little while ago. I said, but there it is. He said, all right. So I went back a week later, and I had an invitation to go to a job at Dartmouth, and he took me aside and he said, I don't know about that. They wear corduroys up there. Princeton's view of Dartmouth College. Okay. In the back room of the faculty club, where the old guys have lunch off the bar, is a big group picture of the Stanford University faculty in around 1900. And if you look carefully at that, you'll see a fellow sitting down front with a high hat in his lap, not on his head. And his name is Frank Angell, A-N-G-E-L-L. Frank Angell had gotten a PhD with Wilhelm Wundt at Leipzig and had been an acquaintance of David Starr Jordan's. So David Starr Jordan in 1892 said, well, Angell, you've been at Cornell for a year, but I'd like you to come over and head up the psychology department at Stanford. Of course, heading up the department was being the department. So Frank Angell came out here